Chapters 16, 17, 18, 19 of The Mirror of the Sea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mirror of the Sea by Joseph Conrad. Overdue and Missing. Chapter 16. Often I turn with melancholy eagerness to the space reserved in the newspapers under the general heading of Shipping Intelligence. I meet there the names of ships I have known. Every year some of these names disappear, the names of old friends. Tempi Pesati. The different divisions of that kind of news are set down in their order, which varies but slightly in its arrangement of concise headlines. And first comes Speakings, reports of ships met and signaled at sea, name, port, where from, where bound for, so many days out, ending frequently with the words, "all well." Then come Wrecks and Casualties, a longish array of paragraphs, unless the weather has been fair and clear, and friendly to ships all over the world. On some days there appears the heading "Overdue," an ominous threat of loss and sorrow trembling yet in the balance of fate. There is something sinister to a seaman in the very grouping of the letters from which form this word, clear in its meaning and seldom threatening in vain. Only a very few days more, appallingly few to the hearts which had set themselves bravely to hope against hope. 3 weeks, a month later perhaps, the name of ships under the blight of the overdue heading shall appear again in the column of Shipping Intelligence, but under the final declaration of missing. The ship or bark or brig so-and-so, bound from such a port, with such and such a cargo, for such another port, having left at such and such a date, last spoken at sea on such a day, and never having been heard of since, was posted today as missing. Such, in its strictly official eloquence, is the form of funeral orations on ships that, perhaps wearied with a long struggle, or in some unguarded moment that may come to the readiest of us, had let themselves be overwhelmed by a sudden blow from the enemy. Who can say? Perhaps the men she carried had asked her to do too much, had stretched beyond breaking point the enduring faithfulness which seems wrought and hammered into that assemblage of iron ribs and plating, of wood and steel and canvas and wire, which goes to the making of a ship, a complete creation endowed with character, individuality, qualities, and defects, by men whose hands launch her upon the water, and that other men shall learn to know with an intimacy surpassing the intimacy of man with man, to love with a love nearly as great as that of man for woman, and often as blind in its infatuated disregard of defects. There are ships which bear a bad name, but I have yet to meet one whose crew, for the time being, failed to stand up angrily for her against every criticism. One ship which I call to mind now had the reputation of killing somebody every voyage she made. This was no calumny, and yet I remember well, somewhere far back in the late '70s, that the crew of that ship were, if anything, rather proud of her evil fame, as if they had been an utterly corrupt lot of desperadoes glorying in their association with an atrocious creature. We, belonging to other vessels moored all about the circular quay in Sydney, used to shake our heads at her with a great sense of the unblemished virtue of our own well-loved ships. I shall not pronounce her name. She is missing now, after a sinister but from the point of view of her owners, a useful career extending over many years, and I should say across every ocean of our globe. Having killed a man for every voyage, and perhaps rendered more misanthropic by the infirmities that come with years upon a ship, she had made up her mind to kill all hands at once before leaving the scene of her exploits. A fitting end, this, to a life of usefulness and crime, in a last burst of an evil passion, supremely satisfied on some wild night, perhaps, to the applauding clamour of wind and wave. How did she do it? In the word missing there is a horrible depth of doubt and speculation. Did she go quickly from under the men's feet, or did she resist to the end, letting the sea batter her to pieces, start her butts, wrench her frame, load her with an increasing weight of salt water, and dismasted, unmanageable, rolling heavily, her boats gone, her decks swept, had she wearied her men half to death with the unceasing labour at the pumps before she sank with them like a stone? However, such a case must be rare. I imagine a raft of some sort could always be contrived, and even if it saved no one, it would float on and be picked up, perhaps conveying some hint of the vanished name. Then that ship would not be, properly speaking, missing. She would be lost with all hands, and in that distinction there is a subtle difference, less horror and a less appalling darkness. Chapter 17. The unholy fascination of dread dwells in the thought of the last moments of a ship reported as missing in the columns of the Shipping Gazette. Nothing of her ever comes to light, no grating, no life buoy, no piece of boat or branded oar to give a hint of the place and date of her sudden end. The Shipping Gazette does not even call her lost with all hands. She remains simply missing. She has disappeared enigmatically into a mystery of fate as big as the world, where your imagination of a brother sailor, of a fellow servant and lover of ships, may range unchecked. And yet, sometimes, one gets a hint of what the last scene may be like in the life of a ship and her crew, which resembles a drama in its struggle against a great force bearing it up, formless, ungraspable, chaotic, and mysterious as fate. It was on a grey afternoon, in the lull of a 3 days' gale, that had left the southern ocean tumbling heavily upon our ship, under a sky hung with rags of clouds that seemed to have been cut and hacked by the keen edge of a sou'west gale. Our craft, a Clyde-built bark of 1,000 tons, rolled so heavily that something aloft had carried away. No matter what the damage was, but it was serious enough to induce me to go aloft myself with a couple of hands and the carpenter to see the temporary repairs properly done. Sometimes we had to drop everything and cling with both hands to the swaying spars, holding our breath in fear of a terribly heavy roll. And wallowing as if she meant to turn over with us, the bark, her decks full of water, her gear flying in bights, ran at some 10 knots an hour. We had been driven far south, much farther that way than we had meant to go, and suddenly, up there in the slings of the foreyard, in the midst of our work, I felt my shoulder grip with such force in the carpenter's powerful paw that I positively yelled with unexpected pain. The man's eyes stared close in my face, and he shouted, "Look, sir, look! What's this?" pointing